I am a child of the Vietnam War, you might say. I remember we had there a young boy who was probably 10 or 12 years old who had been blinded by touching an anti-personnel mine.
This is Silent Killers, a podcast from Face to Face and the international campaign to ban landmines. In 1997, the world said enough and signed the Mine Ban Treaty, but landmines are still claiming lives in many countries around the world. In this series, we meet survivors, frontline workers, and global change makers, all fighting for a mine-free world. From Cambodia to the Ukraine, the danger is real, the work is urgent, and the path to peace is possible. Step by step and yet still under our feet. This is Silent Killers. Well, welcome back to another conversation about a very serious issue. Peter Herby, thank you for joining me in this conversation and this ongoing conversation, and one that you've been having, by the sound of it, since about 1983. And I was wondering if you could just sort of provide a little bit of context for us from your perspective. You know, why are you sitting here today at this summit? Why do you care about this issue that just seems to be kind of never ending? And one of the things that's really struck me, Peter, is that the landmine issue is a solvable problem, and yet we haven't been able to get there yet. So would love to hear a little bit about that and your background and how you've become a consultant in disarmament issues and so on and so forth. Yeah. And thanks again for your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah. No, it's a long story. I mean, I am a child of the Vietnam War, you might say. So I was, even when I was 15, 17, 18, I was very aware of, the human cost of war and armed conflict, and also a lot of the horrors, what was happening in Vietnam, the bombings and napalm, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was one formative experience in seeing and understanding how horrific war is and what the human cost is on all sides, basically. And then I had the chance to come to Geneva in 1983 to work for the Quaker United Nations Office on arms control issues. So these were the bad old days of the last part of the Cold War. And I also grew up in the days when, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were supposed to hide under our school desks to protect against the nuclear attack. And so it was like somehow in the air. So I worked in the 80s for the Quaker UN office a lot on the Chemical Weapons Convention negotiations and a lot on nuclear test ban, treaty discussions, and so on. And so after 10 years of that, I had gotten to know the arms control community in Geneva quite well, or internationally. And then I had the chance to work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. They had not been really involved in arms negotiations for many, many years. So they were looking for somebody who knew the arms control community and the disarmament structures and so on. So I started there in 1994 during the campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines. So we worked on that, and at the same time campaigned to ban blinding laser weapons, which were another bad idea that we could nip in the bud. Fortunately, unlike many other weapons where it takes decades of human costs, human suffering to realize something must be done. So that was one bad idea that was stopped. So the anti-personnel landmines issue was, from the outset for me, extremely compelling, because you could see that the human cost, it was obvious. We saw in the ICRC that there were more people killed by anti-personnel mines after conflicts than during conflicts. Most of them were civilians, and so on. And it was also compelling because there really hadn't been an honest discussion of the military utility of anti-personnel landmines. There was everyone had them. They were even sort of given away free as part of big arms deals. Okay, you can have a few 100,000 anti-personnel mines as well as whatever else you're buying. So they were easy to use, difficult to clear, and devastating mainly for civilians. So, it was such a compelling case. But I also, of course, I was deeply influenced by many of the mine victims that I came to know over the years, like Tun Cheneret from Cambodia, and his story and his courage in going around the world and arguing passionately for a ban. I remember one time when they were negotiating the amended Protocol 2, which was, frankly, a treaty which encourages the continued use of anti-personnel landmines, but it wasn't a done deal yet at that point. But Tun was standing outside the UN entrance here, or not standing, he was in his wheelchair, and he was delivering to every diplomat that drove in their big black Mercedes. He would give them a ban landmines thing, and he would stop the car, and the UN security didn't know what to do, because this was quite visible in the media,
of course,
these negotiations.
Yes.
And the UN just couldn't arrest a mine survivor in front of the UN during the mine ban negotiations. So he's one of the heroes of this movement, and there are many. But then other mine survivors that I met, I remember in Croatia, we gathered Red Cross, Red Crescent people in Croatia during the campaign to ban landmines. And I remember we had there a young boy who was probably 10 or 12 years old, who had been blinded by touching an anti-personnel mine. And he told his story. And part of his story was he was being rehabilitated in a clinic somewhere near Zagreb. And he made best friends with this other boy who had lost his legs from anti-personnel landmines. And the story he told, which, is brings tears to your eyes. It's like these two boys, one of them was in a wheelchair and the other was blind. And so the boy who was blind would push the wheelchair, and the boy who didn't have his leg would tell him which way to go. And it's like, God. And I later learned from the Croatians involved in the mine ban treaty implementation that this boy had gone on to become like a fantastic concert pianist in Zagreb.
Wow.
And
it's stories like that, though. It's really about holding sort of that tension too, isn't it? To some degree, the sadness of it, and yet there's hope in that as well, and there's something to be celebrated that he went on to do that with his life and to become this concert pianist and so on. So how have you maintained, a long history of working on these issues, seeing changes, seeing people stepping in and pulling back? I'd love to talk about sort of the status quo-like nature of what's going on right now, but how have you maintained that sense of hope? Because in that story, it sounds like there's a lot of hope there. And that's something that I continue to see as a thread in this conversation. The treaty itself was founded on hope, really.
Yeah, you have to have hope, and you can have hope by seeing that sometimes things work out against all odds, which is what this treaty represents. That everyone said it was impossible and it was naive, and no way you're going to get military around the world to ban landmines. And now, whatever 90% of the world's countries are party to this treaty. You also changed. We were able to change the perception of military utility at that time. Although now that's going back with these countries that are withdrawing. It's sort of a naive belief nowadays that they're of some value. People don't even have any evidence. It's just like nostalgic desire to have everything they can get. But hope. It's also seeing so many people who are continuing to invest in this cause, as people that are from all over the world that are still at it. What I find, but this is probably more, it is more on the activist side, civil society. There are people who've been doing this for decades, and they know the story inside out, and their lives are rooted in this because they know what it means for human beings. And I think what's deteriorated is the diplomatic side. That, during the period when we had the campaign, we had, let's say 10, 15, 20 countries that were really, key advocates, including Canada, Norway, South Africa, countries all over the world, Mexico, and they really invested in this. It had a high degree of political attention back home in the media and with their politicians. And I think one of the problems now is that it was so successful that it's become, let's say, a bit of a machine, the implementation process, and people. Too many people think that having these meetings is implementation. I mean, a lot of the diplomats, the only involvement they have is meetings, chairing this and discussing that, and but they aren't always ready to look at the big picture and look at the challenges and then work creatively to meet them. Like we have far, far, far too many extensions of mine clearance deadlines. It's going on, if not above 100 extensions now. And this was meant to be the exception when we negotiated the treaty. There was a deadline in order to rally attention and financial support if a country didn't meet its originally 10-year deadline. But now it's become business as usual. It's the main business of meetings of states parties, is extending deadlines. And this year, which was 2025, was supposed to be the year when the year of completion. This was decided at the 2015 review conference. So it was like completion 2025. Well, instead we have 13 countries getting deadline extended. And some of them have had extensions 2 or 3, sometimes 4 times. And during the ICBL has documented that during extended deadlines, there have been at least 25,000 casualties. So that's a heavy cost for what's happening. Okay, it's happening for reasons other than the diplomatic process. It's happening because countries are having a hard time. First of all, many countries don't prioritize clearance. They're happy to have outside help and to clear, but it isn't a top national priority. Sometimes it shouldn't be. I mean, there are other problems in the world too, but there's, let's say, inadequate financial and political attention in many countries, affected countries. But there's also a feeling that, well, you can always get another 5 years or 3 years, 5 years, whatever, because the pattern has shown that you will always get an extension, with plans, without plans, with or without fulfilling what you should have done from the last extension. Sure. So we worked for years to raise this issue, and there was not a lot of appetite for discussing this among the states parties. It was considered too critical of the countries who were facing deadlines, but of course, they can't do it alone, and the countries who are financially able to support clearance can't do it alone. It has to be together, but it also needs to be understood that this should not be business as usual. We need to have more and more countries finishing their clearance obligations, not to mention several who haven't finished their stockpile destruction, in particular Greece and Ukraine. I mean, they're both, I think those were 2008, 2010, and they're still not done.
Wow. So it sort of makes you wonder if on certain levels, becoming a part of it was a political move. Mm. Need to tell your citizens, need to tell the world that you're stepping in. but in truth, not really actually committing to the process. And, sleeves weren't actually rolled up. It wasn't, we weren't really going to work that hard to make this happen.
Yeah.
After so many years of working through the issue on so many levels, have you ever reduced it to one or two issues? Because that's something that keeps my background's in philosophy academically and like to ask questions. And sometimes I'm more interested in the question than I am the answer, because I want to know where is it going to lead us? Is it going to lead to a better resolution or a better understanding, I suppose, than a black and white answer? Has there been a theme? You go, oh, gee, it's all about big business, or it's really a political thing, or we don't have the emphasis on the resources that we need. We got to focus on, or is it really way more complicated and comprehensive than that and layered?
I think the key is keeping human beings at the center of what this is about, and realizing you're saving people's lives or you're improving their lives. One of the problems is within government circles, this is considered disarmament. And, I don't even like the term humanitarian disarmament. Coming from the ICRC originally for most of this work, the framework is international humanitarian law. So that's based on a whole set of moral values that you should limit the brutality of war, that civilians should be spared, and that there are limits in war. And disarmament has another objective, which is to establish security at lower levels of weapons, which is like preventing or managing arms races and so on, and avoid wasteful military expenditure. And the purpose of this work, this treaty, is to protect and save human lives. It's not to achieve some vague idea of disarmament, although you are destroying a type of weapon which is unacceptable. But I think what's unique about this treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions historically is that usually weapons were simply prohibited, their use was prohibited. So in 1925, chemical and biological weapons their use was prohibited, but countries continued to stockpile and manufacture. Then they said, but this is only for retaliation, but you could still have the weapon. And this was a comprehensive prohibition of production, stockpiling, transfer, and use. It was modeled in part on the Chemical Weapons Convention, which was finally, so 25, they banned the use of chemical weapons. In 1992-3, they banned we got the comprehensive ban. So, and then 5 years later, we got the mine ban treaty. And then what it's even more unique about the treaty is that it not only bans all these activities related to the weapon, but it requires remedial action. So clearance of lands, assistance to victims, and international cooperation to achieve this. So it's historically unique in those ways.
There's so many questions, Peter, and maybe it's because I've been here for a few days now. I've had a lot of conversations. I'm relatively new to this issue. I've made a film called Broken Courage. The listeners have heard about it before, about a man from Cambodia who lost a leg to a landmine. When I started going to Cambodia in 2003, it was over 20 years ago, one of the most heavily landmine countries in the world. So this is now become a tangible issue for me as well. I've seen it out in the country, rural settings, and so on. Not that far outside of the city of Phnom Penh, and you think, wow, it's kind of surreal in a way, right? As a tourist, as a consultant back in the day. But I wonder, where does the moral side to this argument come into play? And you look at culturally relative kind of notions of what's right and what's wrong. And, you could find an awful lot of people at the summit here that would probably refer to landmines as being evil. And yet I think we could use the word gleeful as well when you look at some militaries around the world that are actually using them, even currently, that are using them almost with a certain degree of morbid pleasure. Is that a crazy statement? Do you know where I'm going with that? In the sense that it's like a form of torture. So we're going to lay these landmines. We know it's really not that effective from a military perspective, but we're going to do it anyway because really we don't like this other group of people very much. So at the core of that, to me, is just, well, okay, now we've got the fundamental problem of racism. So I think as I've been looking and listening and hearing these stories and looking at some of the data and so on, I start to wonder, maybe we need to start asking some new questions. There's a lot in that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in war, you can attack the enemy, the enemy military and their military objectives and so on. So, and of course, there may be, or there often is, a sort of pleasure in destroying the enemy, and that's part of the warrior ethos, and it's sort of a grim pleasure, I suppose, in some way for some. But what's wrong with AP mines and some other weapons is just that their indiscriminate nature, the brutality, the nature of the injury alone. Like the Red Cross ran war hospitals in Cambodia and Afghanistan for many years, and the length of the hospital visits is months beyond anything from other war injuries. The number of blood transfusions, the number of surgical interventions when you amputate a leg, it's far beyond gunshot wounds or shrapnel wounds or other types of injuries. And this isn't even to mention the lifelong care that's needed when a person has lost one or two legs. And then if you add to that most of the people suffering this are civilians, it's horrendous. It's simply some kind of random brutality or callousness. Okay, let's say back in the 90s when we were running a campaign, okay, the military uses what it has and leaves when they've done the job.
Oh, and Peter, at one time, I mean, I'm no historian, but I'm pretty sure they used boiling oil over the side of a castle wall. Did they not?
Yes, and in Geneva, when the Savoyards attacked, they poured hot soup.
Hot soup. The
myth is, or the legend is, this woman poured hot soup over in the middle of the night. They were climbing the wall, and that celebration will be on the 12th December, I think.
Interesting.
And it was pretty nasty surprise.
Of course, yeah. It's and I mean the chemical weapons ban. I mean, my father was he was in the Royal Air Force in the 50s in the Singapore-Malaya Communist conflict back in the day, but I remember him telling as a kid in just outside of London, they had gas masks, mustard gas. Right? Chemical warfare, and so on. So it's just, you wonder what really is at the core of this. I walked into the room here at the UN, a little intimidating, I suppose, on some levels, right? Just because of what it represents and so on. And I see, close to 1,000 people, and I think, why is this such a difficult problem? And I've asked this question a couple times of a few people. There is no really easy answer, I suppose. But you've talked a little bit about the legality of it, the morality of it, the diplomacy of it. It's very layered, it seems. And it's maybe is there a new strategy, Okay, so we got 165 countries. All right. Which is the next most strategic country that we've got to start lobbying? And I know there's not an answer to that necessarily.
Yeah.
But again, sometimes coming out of these types of conversations, interesting things happen.
Well, at the moment, I think the key is stopping countries leaving.
Yes,
we see these 5 leaving, and we see that many countries who have been champions in the past, including basically Western countries, are making excuses, or at least they're not pushing back hard enough to stop countries who are part of their military alliance from leaving the treaty. I wish that let's say a year ago or 2 years ago, European / NATO countries could have said to the Lithuanians, Ukrainians, all the 5 who have left, don't even think about it. Like, we don't want these weapons on the battlefield, that we should fight with you on. Like, these are antiquated, fairly useless weapons. They're going to contaminate the battlefield, and just don't even think about that. Well, that apparently didn't happen. And now, many are making excuses for that this is a particular situation, that special consideration needs to be given to the fact that, it's an invasion. But this is not the only conflict in the world.
Well, it's not really a treaty at that point, is it?
Yeah, no,
if you're going to step back
good intention
from time to time.
Yeah, when you
look to the footnote.
Yeah, and what's particularly disturbing is that these countries are leaving. But I was saying earlier, in the 1990s, 80s, okay, maybe the military wasn't so aware of what the long-term effects of the using AP mines were, how much more it affected civilians, how little it actually slowed down modern armed forces. Well, now all these countries who are leaving and all that are in it are fully aware. I mean, they went through this process of realizing why these needed to be banned. And these decisions to leave are being made with no evidence whatsoever that I'm aware of that there's been a reevaluation of the military utility of anti-personnel landmines. Indeed, nor of cluster munitions in the case of Lithuanians withdraw from that treaty. There's no evidence that anything has changed in terms of how effective they will be, nor how they will affect civilian populations. So it's like it's a highly political motive for leaving a treaty which will have long-term effects not only on this treaty, but on any treaties that apply in armed conflict. So
it's been, like in Cambodia's perspective, over 50 years, still dealing with this weapon. I mean, the absurdity of that. I mean, the infrastructural implications, socioeconomic implications, the mental health implications. How do you quantify, as we were talking earlier in a conversation, how do you quantify lost opportunity? So I don't know, it's like somewhere along the way, the story got taken out of context or sort of warped in some way. Yeah. You talked about the cluster munitions. Thank you. Yeah. The Convention on Cluster Munitions. What are the differences between the Mine Ban Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munition?
Well, there are important differences about the weapon itself. In that one cluster munitions are meant to explode when they are used and hit the target. So the problem is the failure rate. Something in China it was 40% failure rate. Even modern cluster munitions that are supposed to be perfect and 99% reliable have been seen to have a 10-15% failure rate. For example, those used in southern Lebanon by the Israelis. So that one fundamental difference is cluster munitions cause a problem when they fail to work. Okay, they may also be indiscriminate if used over a large area with population or civilian objects, but the problem is their failure rate, whereas AP mines are doing exactly what they're intended to do, which is to sit in the ground until somebody steps on them and to explode. So, but in terms of the structure of the treaty, the comprehensive prohibition of everything from development, production, stockpiling, use, they're virtually the same. Cluster Munitions Convention came 11 years later, but it was modeled on the Mine Ban Convention. I think the biggest difference is that the Convention on Cluster Munitions has a whole article on victim assistance, which is much in the Mine Ban Convention. There's a commitment or a provision that states will cooperate for the assistance of victims. So it's like international cooperation to assist victims. But then, because in practice it was always considered one of the pillars of the Mine Ban Treaty, even though the provisions in the treaty are fairly minimal, But the practice was, the pillars of mine action are the prohibitions, clearance, stockpile destruction, and victim assistance. So the Cluster Convention incorporated what had become the practice under the Mine Ban Convention. So, yeah, I think people always think that the humanitarians are the woolly ones, and that they have, do good, and they're going to trying to save the world, and they're the idealists. But one of the things that I've seen is that, all of the treaties we have that have been developed over the last 30 years, mine ban, cluster munitions, and several others, explosive remnants of war, are based on the humanitarians, people, part of the discussion, providing hard evidence about how these weapons are affecting human beings. The same with the work on explosive weapons in populated areas. We come with the evidence, and that's undeniable. But then you have reversals like what's happening on the Mine Ban Convention that are just taken with no evidence, no new arguments, no new evidence, no real research as to whether this thing will work.
It's like a false sense of security in some respect. Something shifted and said, no, we need everything that we have at our disposal, to defend ourselves or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, it's some basic human instinct to if you're suffering enough, you I guess want everything you can to make the enemy suffer more.
To make the enemy suffer, which brings me sort of back to that point about cruelty and evil and the pleasure conversation we had, that I think there is a thin veneer, I don't know who said that academically, or historically, there's that thin veneer of where society works. Yeah. And then when something goes sideways, it no longer works, and people are literally at one another's throats. Yeah. So this idea of helping or loving your neighbor goes out the window very quickly, right? When you're under a certain kind of duress. How do you think we gotta unfortunately wrap this up in a couple of minutes? What can the international community do to collectively push back and to? Is there anything they can do together? Here we are again at the summit. We've got all these people involved and so on, and all these states that are stronger together, right? Yeah. In theory and in practice. Yeah. How can they do anything in the immediate future to say, no, not legal, not acceptable, you can't leave, or you can't suspend?
Well, there's a lot that can be done. These countries are not powerless. I think it's to do with leadership. And if we had 10 countries in this treaty who decided that they were going to really take the lead in relation to one of the big challenges, for example, the endless extension of clearance deadlines, and of course, combined with the resource problems which give rise to the need to extend deadlines, that's one package. Another is universalization, that that there needs to be a much more high-level effort. So let's say another country takes on universalization in a big way and really invests in that and brings together partner countries to develop strategies around that in relation to the countries who are withdrawing or those who may consider it, to really get together a group of countries who, including, if possible, their military, to meet with these countries and say, look, this is a bad idea. It's a waste of money. The ICRC just published a very important blog post that is looking at the military utility issues, and it demonstrates that basically they're more irrelevant and useless than ever before because of all of the other options that are now available on the battlefield.
Peter, and we got to wrap it up, but which is absurd when you think of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's okay to kill people this way, but let's not do it that way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Speaking of, as a legal expert, speaking of the moral and ethical implications, it seems rather absurd.
Well, except it's not just coming up with new ways to kill. It's like if you're going to fight wars, you probably should use things that actually hit what you're aiming at, and don't have all these side effects that go on for decades. So like a lot of
the military utility argument is still very prescient. Like it's an important piece of this conversation still.
Yeah, it's the perception that by people who probably haven't spent 10 minutes thinking about it, that we need everything we can get. I mean, that's what some of the politicians in the Baltic countries were literally saying. Even if it's a minimal, value, we want it because we need everything. And that emotionally, anyone can understand that. We want to stop these guys. But in terms of rationality, it's not very rational because there are many other options more than ever before of weapons that, if you look at drones, precision guidance systems, satellites, I mean, on the modern battlefields, countries are able to know what's happening out there and to actually hit what they're aiming at, rather than just throw a lot of mines around and hope somebody steps on them. When we, for ICRC, commissioned a study of military utility in 1995 that brought together officers who had used mines, and they told us that even in the best of circumstances, in a traditionally laid minefield, there would be 1 in 10 chance that a soldier crossing it would actually step on a mine. So, I mean, that's not very accurate. But if you leave them there for a few years or decades, comes towards 100% chance that a civilian will step on it.
Going to step on it. Wow.
So they were never that useful. And nowadays, in terms of monitoring the battlefield and actually hitting things that you're trying to stop, there's many more options. So it's just like stunning that people would go back to something that doesn't work very well.
So as we just wrap this up, I feel like, I'd like to, I think most of the conversations I have, I still sense that there's hope, there's a tenacity there, there's a desire and a commitment and a passion and all of those things, a lot of it going on in this building. And at this particular summit, lots of other things going on around the world that are good as well. Any thoughts about what's next? In not only in the immediate future. For me, I feel like compassion has been set aside currently in the world we're living in. When you look at things that are going on in the West and just pretty much anywhere. Pretty much I was going to say any newspaper you pick up, but any news platform that you go to and spend time on, I think you could probably develop a pretty decent argument that compassion has left the building. But I'm not, I don't know how to attend to that. I don't know what's next, but I'm interested to hear if you have any thoughts.
Okay, one thing is just, as you said, tenacity. I mean, there are a lot of people in the world, and including all of us and diplomats and military, who do have a moral conscience, and people need to continue, awakening it in themselves and others, and sticking together and insisting that we're not going anywhere. Because, I tell my kids, in relation to climate, I can't tell you, is it too late? Are things going to really get worse in their generation? They are getting worse now. But what I can say for sure is, if you don't push back, they are going to get worse faster. And so in this field, I grew up during the Cold War and was involved in arms issues then, and it looked pretty grim. I mean, we didn't know at which point we would have a nuclear war, and people kept campaigning and insisting and calling attention to the horror of this, and the same with the mine ban. I mean, we were told we were naive, and what's even better now is that this treaty, we have plenty of evidence that it works exactly as it's designed when it's implemented. It has brought down the casualties, at one point it was, when we were campaigning on this in the early 90s, there were estimated 20,000 casualties a year, according to ICRC data. In around 2013 or 15, it went down to 3,000 a year that were recorded by Landmine Monitor. Now they're going up. They have gone up again in the last 10 years because of especially improvised AP mines, and now the factory-made mines that are being used in Ukraine. So, but it works. It has to be. It just has to be applied, and we have to be just obstinate and persistent, and say, there's no shortcut. Just keep doing it, and also do better at ensuring and insisting that all of the obligations of the convention are implemented. But finally, it has such bigger implications about the protection of civilians in war. The Geneva Conventions, everything to do with limiting the horrors of war. If we go down the route that some countries are going down under the treaty now to suspend their obligations because there's an armed conflict, then that's extremely contagious and extremely dangerous, and not just because of mines. I mean, there's nothing compared to what could be done if countries start suspending their other obligations.
Yeah, I think, the notion that it works, I mean, if that's not a name for a campaign, I've heard lots of slogans or phrases that we could use for an advocacy campaign. But listen, thank you for exploring some of these issues with me. Super, not easy to talk about, but it's good to know there are people like you who have been at it for so many years, and you're still passionately committed to it. So thanks for the hard work that you've done.
Master.
That's right. Thanks for joining me today. Really enjoyed chatting with you.
Okay, you can take that out if you want.